Hi, everyone. All right, I see that we are live on Facebook and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Thank you, everyone who's joining us here either on Facebook or on Zoom for our event tonight. As the South goes, so goes education. My name is Crystal. I use she, her pronouns. I am a graduate student worker at the University of Virginia and a member of the steering committee for UCWVA at UVA. So before we get started, I just want to ask, we did choose to do this not in webinar form so that we can see each other's faces at the end when we're asking questions. But for this first half of the event, I just want to ask for those of you who are not a speaker or panelist tonight to go ahead and make sure you're unmuted and that your camera is off so that the video will stay on people who are speaking. Thank you in advance for agreeing to do that. And then we'll let everyone go like camera on at the end when we're taking questions from the audience. So the way the evening will go is that I will do a brief introduction for our main speaker tonight, Bill Fletcher Jr. And then Bill will lecture, and then we'll pivot to a wider conversation with Kate Dietrich and Kristen Reed, who are both here tonight, will introduce themselves later. And then we will open it up to all the attendees, both on Facebook and on Zoom for questions. The way questions are going to work is you can either DM them to me privately if you're on Zoom, or if you're on Facebook. I think there's going to be a place for you to type those in and someone will send them to me. I'm going to exercise, depending on how many we get, exercise a little moderators privileges and maybe like group some questions together by theme, and then we can take it from there. So just want to make sure that as many people, as many perspectives as possible get to be voiced in the Q&A section. Finally, I just want to say a huge congratulations and welcome to our comrades at UCWVA at Virginia Commonwealth University, who just went public this week. They went public on Monday with a very beautiful launch. To all of those who were there on Monday or helped organize it, congratulations, an incredible job. This event was scheduled purposefully to build on that public launch as a one place in which people who are just learning about this workers' organization can come and learn not just about kind of the rights and privileges we have as workers in this state and in this country to unionize and organize collectively with each other, but about how we step into power with one another as an organization, as an organized entity. So not just as workers, but workers who have committed to organizing together in solidarity towards common goals and purposes. So with that, I will go ahead and get us started. So Bill Fletcher Jr., who's our speaker tonight, is an activist, writer, and theorist of labor and social justice movements. He's the author of several books, including The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the CIO, Peter Aggard, They're Bankrupting Us, and 20 Other Myths About Unions. And finally, Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, which was co-authored with Dr. Fernando Gapasin. And I first encountered Bill Fletcher Jr.'s work, especially this last book, Solidarity Divided, on social justice unionism, which is a concept we'll be talking a little bit about tonight, through my own workers' organization, UCWVA, United Campus Workers Virginia. And our union came together last summer during a global pandemic and an ongoing reckoning with racial injustice and police violence. And since then, we have sought to build an organization for higher ed workers in Virginia that sees economic and social injustice as fundamentally intertwined. We were inspired by the practices and victories of other UCW chapters across the country, and we realized that we could not fight for a living wage without also caring about the rising cost of living. We couldn't talk about Black and Brown workers' experiences on the job without also talking about policing and surveillance. We couldn't think about ourselves as deserving of respect from our employer without also thinking of all the other forces in society which keep us down. At UCWVA, we were starting to practice social justice unionism before many of us even knew the term. Reading and studying Solidarity Divided with other leaders in our union has given me a much stronger vocabulary to define what it is you want to be doing and where it is you want to go. And just as importantly, it's showing me where we don't want to go and the mistakes we don't want to repeat. So before I hand the floor over, I just want to share a little bit about my own path to the labor movement and show why I think Mr. Fletcher Jr.'s theory and practice is so important as we talk about how to transform public higher ed into a better force for social good. I chose to come to grad school to study the history of social movements because I wanted to contribute to a broader progressive project of building a better world. And I thought that if I understood how people had come together historically to fight racial and economic injustice and how they use politics to achieve those ends, I would be able to meaningfully contribute some knowledge to the movement. So looking back, I can honestly say that working as a grad student at UVA taught me more about politics than all my research put together. I did study Marx in my first semester in grad school, but I learned more intimately and more viscerally about exploitation the first time I had to grade 60 papers in 48 hours or was asked to wipe up all the sandwich crumbs after a faculty lunch. And during all of this, it was never lost on me that it was disproportionately women and women of color especially who were taking on the burden of extra care work in my department and my college. You cannot work or study for a single day at UVA or really any other public institution of higher ed in this state without noticing in some way, shape, or form the methods universities rely upon to divide and exploit their workers. We have all heard UVA make promises about doing better, about reconciliation, about being great and good. The university will study its own violent history of white supremacy, but in the present day, it is paying its workers, many of them women and people of color, poverty wages. It will sign 20-year contracts with private corporations like Aramark that depress pay and deny their employees job security and benefits. It will buy up land in Charlottesville and make it harder for its working class employees to live here. All these experiences, both my own and those of the people who worked next to and around me, were what led me to join UCWVA last year. I came to UVA to study how people get organized. I joined a workers' organization so I could get organized. What I appreciate so much about Bill Fletcher Jr.'s work is its marriage of history with what we do in the present moment. He gives us both the theory and the practice. He names the problem of racial capitalism and then shows us in the labor movement a method to organize against it. So through struggle, through practice, lots of trainings, lots of study, I'm learning that organizing the labor movement is a lot harder than I originally thought. But now I also have so much more appreciation for my coworkers' power and my own power. And I have so much more appreciation for why it's so important that we get it right. I am grateful to the labor movement for showing me what feeling rooted in the politics of a place and a community feels like. I am grateful to have learned what it means to fight for justice, not only for others, but for myself as well. And I'm very honored and excited to keep learning from everyone here tonight about what it'll take for us to win. All right, Bill, handing it over to you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And thank you for that great introduction. And I very much appreciate being invited to speak with everyone this evening. And I want to begin by giving a special shout out to your vice president, the vice president for CWA, Communication Workers of America, for the public healthcare education workers, PHEW. That's Margaret Cook. You could not have a better, more eloquent, more fiery person, advocate for the public sector than Margaret. And it's a pleasure and honor to work with her. And it's a pleasure and honor to be with everyone this evening, tonight, to look at what I'm going to cover is like maybe three basic issues. The sort of the importance of the public sector, why it's under attack, and looking at the moment that we're in. And I want to start off with this story, which really encapsulates so much for me. A number of years ago, I was at a social event. Now, I have these very mixed feelings about social events. As a major character in Star Trek once says that social events are warfare concealed. And I think that there is a lot of truth to that. So I found myself in a discussion with this very wealthy businessman. And he was just, he knew I was a trade unionist and a leftist, and he was just beating me up about how the private sector does everything better than the public sector. So I listened to this nonsense for a while. And so then I said, hey, listen, man, you're from New York, aren't you? He said, yeah. I said, I'm from New York too. Said, did you ever notice in New York, the subway system has these different names? At least it used to. IRT, BMT, IND. He said, yeah. I said, well, do you know where that came from? He said, well, no. And I said, well, the New York City subway system used to be private. And that's one of the reasons, if anyone is from New York or visits New York and you look at a subway map, it looks like somebody threw spaghetti up on the wall because the routes make absolutely no sense. They overlap, they crisscross everything. And I said, it was because it was private. I said, well, you're smart. Why isn't it private anymore? He didn't know. I said, because the private sector drove it into the ground and the public sector had to take it up. I said, that's the problem with you rich people, right? You're all in favor of the private sector and no public sector, as long as you're not in trouble. Then the moment that you're in trouble, you want to socialize all the costs. And we see this time and time again. We hear this rhetoric about the private sector can do it better. And more often than not, that's not the case. But what's worse is that when the private sector gets into trouble, when these individual employers get into trouble, they look for help from government. Think about the 2008-2009 recession. When Wall Street was collapsing, what did they do? They didn't kill themselves, right? They didn't say the honorable thing would really be for me to kill myself because I ruined the economy. No, what did they do? They went to the government and they said, bail us out. We don't care about anyone else. Bail us out. These are the people that were attacking big government, that suddenly felt the need for big government. So lesson number one is that there's two myths in the United States that we grew up on. One is the notion that you can raise yourself on your bootstraps. And the second is that the private sector does it better. And both are wrong. If you look at the history of the United States, you see the direct role the public sector has played in the expansion of the country. And in sometimes in great ways and sometimes in terrible ways. I'm thinking about land acquisition, right? That was done through the military. Can't get more public sector than that, right? The railroads and the kind of support that they got from government, canals, the postal service, veterans benefits. I mean, the list goes on and on. And here's where it gets tricky, that when the public sector is described as benefiting everybody, there is very, very broad support. But here's the trick. When the right wing decides to go after the public sector, what it does is it suggests that the public sector is only serving a special interest, usually a special demographic. Like the public sector is serving Black people or Latinos and Latinas or you name the group. I mean, think about what happened when Ronald Reagan wanted to go after the welfare system. Think about the welfare queen. They did not pick a white woman from Appalachia to be the poster child for the welfare system. The whole imagery was that of a Black woman. And so it reminds one of that famous saying, those who the gods will destroy, they first make mad. Well, in the United States, those who the gods will destroy, they first color. And once they color them, then they position it in the situation to say that this is only to the benefit of these irrelevant people, inconsequential people who contribute nothing. And therefore, it is okay to take this down. And after it comes down, then white people who have been benefiting from the system look around and they say, wait a minute, where's it? What happened? And it's all gone. So point number one is that the public sector has been central in the development of this country. That had it not been for a public sector, there would have been nothing, because the capitalists would have simply been at war with one another, and none of them would have been able to put their interests beneath the collective interests. The second point is that in the late 1960s, the economy ran into trouble. at least for the rich. And what it meant was that the rich weren't making the profits that they had been hoping to make. It wasn't that they weren't making profits, but they weren't making them on the scale that they wanted to. There was increasing foreign competition. US capitalists were not keeping up with the times in terms of innovation, et cetera. And it was in this moment in the 1970s that they started squirming around and trying to figure out a different method of moving the economy, something that enriches them. And during much of the 1970s, they experimented. But they began with an experiment, not in the United States, but in Chile. In 1973, the elected government of Chile was overthrown. And a coup brought about a military regime backed by Richard Nixon, then president of the United States. The coup people knew nothing about the economy. They knew nothing about economics. And they went to Milton Friedman and his minions at the University of Chicago and said, we need help. And this became a moment for Milton Friedman and others to experiment with a different approach to the economy, an experiment that involved ripping away what we would now call the social safety net and basically eliminating all obstacles to the accumulation of profits for the wealthy. Now, they were able to do this very successfully because there was a military dictatorship. But there were further experiments. In 1975, New York City faced a major fiscal crisis and was expecting help from the government, the federal government, which it did not get. In that situation, New York City was forced to carry out dramatic cuts, and it laid the foundation for something that we've come to know as neoliberalism, or what I call capitalist fundamentalism. And it was basically stripping away many of the benefits that working people had won over had won over the 20th century. So you introduced a new kind of economics, which then rises to the presidential level when Ronald Reagan becomes the president and Margaret Thatcher became the prime minister of Britain. And at that point, there were no holds barred, and the objective was to weaken unions, to eliminate all organizations of working people, to start stripping away the benefits, the social safety net, to basically put on people more and more the responsibilities that had been carried out by government or in some cases by workers. I mean, you think, for example, about once upon a time, you'd go into a gas station and someone would fill up your tank. But no more, everything is self-service. Once upon a time, you'd go into a bank. No more, you got to use the ATM. So more and more falls on regular people so that the costs are reduced for these companies and more wealth goes to those at the top. So that's a second piece that we've got to understand about what we've been living through. And what I was saying about the way that this was carried out, it was absolutely brilliant. That almost in every case, the argument was made that these different elements of the public sector were to the benefit of an unworthy group, and that it was hardworking people that were suffering because of benefits that were going to this unworthy group. Now, in part because of the victories of the 1960s and 70s, they didn't come out directly and say, well, it's because of these Black people and Latinos and Asians, but they basically, the buttons were there, and the right wing knew which buttons to push, which basically brings us to this moment that we find ourselves in, that we're in a very, very scary moment in which the wealthy are squeezing people at the bottom. If you look at the Trump's tax so-called reform in 2017, that brought incredible benefits to the people at the top, and what that meant for those at the bottom, you see them grabbing more and more of the wealth. The polarization of wealth in the United States is unlike anything that we've seen since the late 1920s. But they're doing it, again, introducing the race card as a way of shifting responsibility for the growing immiserization that white working and middle income people are facing, and shifting that onto targeting people of color. You know, there's I'm very much into movies. And one of my favorite movies is The Usual Suspects with Kevin Spacey. And there's a moment when Kevin Spacey says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world he didn't exist. And I would reframe that and say that the greatest trick that the capitalists ever pulled was to convince white people, and particularly white workers, that racism doesn't really exist. And that, in fact, the problems that are going on in the system and the class oppression that white workers are facing is really the fault of someone else. It's not the fault of the rich. It's not the fault of the major corporations. It's the fault of Jews. It's the fault of African Americans. It's the fault of women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they have been very successful in this. And the movement that brought Donald Trump into power was a movement that was one that was energized by this kind of anger and feeling of resentment that their American dream was falling apart. And this is why the work of your union and the work of the union movement actually becomes critically important, because we are in a battle for democracy right now. We're in a battle to preserve and expand democracy. And there's few other institutions other than unions that can rise to the occasion to actually do this. That unions bring together people of color and whites, men and women, immigrants and non-immigrants. They bring them together and they bring about the possibility of successful power. There's nothing like that. It doesn't guarantee victory, but it brings about the possibility of that. And in the public sector, despite what you will hear from different employers, it's not fundamentally different than in the private sector. In the public sector, you are fighting for dignity, you're fighting to increase and improve your living conditions, and you're fighting for respect, right? That those are very basic demands, and the demands that can only be won, not through the graciousness of an employer, but from them agreeing to a collective bargaining agreement, from them agreeing that the workers have a right to organize. The workers need to be respected, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector. It makes your job so important. And in trying to fight the forces out there, such as the forces that tried to carry out a coup on January 6th, we have to demonstrate that the enemy is not to be found in some other ethnic group. The enemy is not women. The enemy is not gays and lesbians. The enemy is not immigrants. It's not people of color. The enemy are those that we frequently don't even see because they sit high up in buildings that are where the glass is covered, where they are invisible to us. That enemy wants to see us play one against another, which is why we have to come together in these formations called unions, why we have to step forward and demand, in fact, insist on our rights. It's why your relationship with the Communication Workers of America is so important, right? And why this unionization effort that you've just embarked on is potentially historic. But regardless of whether historic, it's absolutely essential. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to, I want to open this up. We're going to invite Katie Dietrich and Kristen Reed to join me, and we're going to have a little discussion. And the way I'd like to actually kick it off, and I realize that everybody's giving me a standing ovation right now, which I can't hear, but thank you. I really appreciate that. But what I want to do is I want to ask Katie and Kristen about your situation, about how you think that the way that I frame the situation is relevant or not to the situation that you're in the union organizing effort. And whoever would like to start, please. And don't be shy. Otherwise, I'm gonna call on you.
I can start. Can you all hear me?
Good.
All right. My name is Kate Diedrich, and I'm a strategic researcher for the Communications Workers of America, where I am lucky and fortunate enough to support the United Campus Worker organizing efforts across the Southeast. So excited for VCU and to be working with everyone in Virginia, but also UCW locals and members across the South. I personally cut my teeth in the labor movement as an organizer in training at SEIU in 2012, where I worked on a campaign to organize adjunct faculty at Tufts University. So I started out in higher ed, and give another shout out to the VCU adjuncts, who I know have been a critical organizing force at VCU, and that effort to organize adjuncts is so important. So I mostly do strategic research to support our locals and help members to do that, and power analyses and research on targets. But personally, I also have grown up so developed by the public sector and by higher education. My father was a college professor in a small Rust Belt town in Michigan, and my mom was a public librarian. I went to school with the same crew of people from kindergarten through high school. And, as the Midwest is, it was a very diverse town, Black, white, some new immigrants, some agricultural workers, quite a few hanging on, factory workers, but also, an increasing unemployment, high levels of unemployment and poverty because of the devastation to that region of the country. And I saw the importance of public sector jobs for keeping people somewhat afloat, along with just the importance of both higher education and the public sector as a whole, the public library as a place that we all were able to be, despite just such extreme kind of difference of material conditions. And I think the one thing, all of that you spoke to, Bill, really absolutely corresponds with my personal experience and why I'm committed to being in the labor movement and what I see with our UCW members across the region. But I do think that one of our major challenges in higher education is that, yes, the powers that be want to undercut the public aspect of it, but instead of just completely gutting it, they said, oh, this actually looks like it's redeemable as long as we can privatize it, outsource it, use it for land grabs, use it as our corporate training ground where students are going to go into debt and we're going to get them the training for our industry jobs and they'll pay for it. And then we will have them come work for us. So I can speak more as we kind of get into the discussion about this sort of the crises in the industry and the defining characteristics. And I know Kristen can speak to the experience of working in higher ed. But that's one thing I might add to the conversation, is just the particular nature of the both like right-wing vitriol against higher education, but also the ways in which they've seen it as a site of possible expansion for those people sitting in their glass offices that you mentioned and controlling things. So I'll end there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Kristen, you're on.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. There's a lot of people I really admire on this call. My name is Kristen Reed. I'm a faculty member at Virginia Commonwealth University. I've been at VCU for 12 years. I'm excited to be supporting the rollout of the union here at VCU. A lot like Kate, I am from the Midwest. I grew up in very rural Ohio, and I'm also a kid of a kind of public sector worker family and union family. My immediate and my extended family is a lot of pre-K through 12 teachers, My aunt was the president of her teachers union in rural Southwest Ohio. My stepmom was the president of her union in one of the factories where I grew up that employed most of the people who I grew up with. And rural Ohio is a place that's really been hit hard by deindustrialization, but I was really lucky to grow up and see what unions are able to offer, the kind of like actually really diverse communities in Northwest Ohio, just in terms of baseline expectations for, as you said, Bill, dignity. And for me, living in the South where union infrastructure has been really devastated, feels very different and feels like very hard to adapt to, in part because our baseline starting point for negotiation is so low. So I live in a neighborhood in Richmond that is historically African-American, and a huge section of my neighborhood has no sidewalks. And that sort of complete neglect of public infrastructure in my state's capital is exactly the kind of public disinvestment that can only exist actually really in the context of generations of systemic racism that has been a ruling class strategy for a city and for a state. And so that is, I think, kind of the context of the campaign that we're launching here in Richmond. But I do think I want to say that part of what is happening right now in the country is that the fight is not just for our dignity, but the fight is also to identify what justice can even look like in the particular historical moment that we're in. And I think the public sector union campaigns that we see emerging statewide, but also nationally, are really well situated to pick those fights. When we look at the union fight in Bessemer, Alabama, for instance, we know as a nation kind of watching that the working conditions in that site are the product of racism. We know that majority Black workforce is coping with racism every day on the job site. But we also have a narrative that's pretty easy for us to unpack, right? We can look at Amazon, we can look at Jeff Bezos, and we can be like, that's pretty standard villain territory. And we can look at the workers and say, these are the heroes of this narrative. In a public sector university, I do think that the lines are much less clear. And I think that the neoliberal takeover of the 21st century university has created a context in which we're at risk of allowing administration to define what racial justice is. And in a university where those lines are far less clear and where people are really struggling to identify what it would even mean to build a university that puts racial justice first, there's not baseline agreement on what that looks like, right? Like a lot of workers feel compelled by some of the narratives that come from admin around simply creating new high-paid executive administrative positions that will be occupied by people of color, and never ever talk about the working conditions of the people who clean and maintain our buildings every day. And our universities are really moving forward at a very quick pace with a program that markets itself as racial justice that does not meet the needs of a majority of the Black and brown people who are on our campuses every day. And that means workers, but it also means students. And so part of what I really hope to see at VCU, at UVA, and statewide in Virginia is a kind of reset on how we think about racial justice in the public sector that allows us to articulate and recognize that corporate America will define a version of racial justice that will allow it to maintain the status quo if we don't build infrastructure to intervene in that. And I think universities are well situated to start to support that infrastructure building.
So one of the questions that I have frequently wondered about is that once upon a time, higher education, public higher education, was very inexpensive. The City University of New York, City College was free during the Depression. The University of California system was very inexpensive. And when you look at the results, it just seems to me people would say, wow, I mean, we were able to educate all these people, the economies grew, we were able to bring these industries, and then there was a real reversal. And most people don't even know how inexpensive public higher education once was. And if you were to tell them, they would think you were just making this up, and don't necessarily think that there should be a demand for that. What do you two make of this?
Well, I will just say I'm a teacher for first and second year students at VCU. So I see the students who come in right out of high school. And part of what that means is I see the students who don't make it to their third year. And so part of what I have witnessed as a cycle as a teacher is a very high intensity demand for students to go to school in high school, in part because pushing students out of high schools and into college admissions can raise the baseline evaluation of a school through a series of, in my estimation, superficial kind of market strategies that are tied into the real estate industry. Those kids take on massive amounts of loans, and they're on the hook for those loans when they leave. And one of the things we see in Richmond is you can look at our circuit courts dockets every week, and you can see all of the landlords who are taking people up for eviction, and you can see VCU taking students to court on fines and fees that they owe to the university. And so I think part of what has happened is higher education has been co-opted by a whole narrative of kind of like upwardly mobile promise that's really tied into ideas of the American dream that sort of tells our kids, listen, you just have to take out this one huge set of loans, but then when you do, you're going to be economically stable after this. That's not true. And it's less true for students of color. It's less true for first generation college students. It's less true for students who are immigrants. It's a lie, and it's a lie that's compounded by other forms of privilege. But I think part of how we need to understand this is that universities have been identified as a political problem in part because they were places where really moving work could be done on issues like economic and racial justice. And so you can look at things like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and you can see amazing activism that's happening in ways that are tied to universities. And you can understand, if you think about that history, why there would be a real investment in white corporate power structure colonizing and destabilizing universities as a way of allowing them to serve interests like the real estate industry and all these other kind of like tech industries that have grown peripherally around universities, and also to saddle a whole new generation of people with debt that can make them really beholden to employers because they can't leave their jobs, right? They have to make all these payments on things like rent and student loans. And so I think it's important to understand the inflation of the costs of universities in the context of university colonization by corporate interests. But it's also, there's just no question, it's driven by disinvestment in the public sector writ large by corporations that don't want to pay their fair share of taxes. And in Virginia, that means companies like Dominion Energy, increasingly it means Amazon, are moving into the state, and their first priority is to destabilize worker rights, and their second priority is to ensure that they have no taxes to pay at the state level. And that has made universities vulnerable to a whole lot of profit-seeking industries that treat students as a market and not as people who are seeking out services that actually should just be a basic human right.
Kate, did you want to add to that?
A little bit. I'll add a little bit on chronic defunding, but that's really great. Kristen, is powerful. I also anecdotally, I once coordinated a study abroad program in Greece, and I joked that, you know, it's similarly free to very low cost still in other places, in other contexts, obviously very different political contexts. And that's probably changing, you know, in there elsewhere over the last 10 years, 10 to 15. But the institutions were crumbling. The buildings didn't have any amenities. There was no sports infrastructure, but students from the US would still pay $40,000 to their undergrad institutions in order to go study abroad there, and thought it was amazing, right? So there's this myth that that, and I mean, it's intentional, that higher education institutions have to compete with one another, and they have to build the next best sports stadium and luxury dormitories and have, you know, entire cinema layouts on campus. LSU, one of our other UCW campuses, built an entire lazy river for students to float down as an amenity while their buildings are falling apart. So there is an increasing cost coming from just this kind of race to, I don't know what, luxury, to attract high-paying students because of chronic defunding of the public sector from the state and expansive privatization. One of those is just really going after international students and out-of-state high-pay students. And in order to attract those in this sort of commodified landscape, they are all trying to compete with one another over sort of very high-cost luxury amenities and sports infrastructure, and that does cost a lot, especially as the cost of land and building goes up, and you know, institutional debt kind of balloons. So I think it's a huge issue, and I think Kristen's points are really important about continuing to invest in the public sector, and also we do need to get back to a point where while we hold this sort of massive infrastructure of amenities, we also don't challenge the very concept that higher education is valuable and worth something, you know, even while we're critical of the costs.
I want to switch gears a little bit and look at the question of the relationship between racial justice and economic justice, and what that means for unions. Because there was something I was struck by that one of you mentioned in your remarks, that about how there are, excuse me, executive positions that are created, and they might put a person of color there, but that the people at the bottom continue to suffer. And in this, in the aftermath of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement over the last several years, there's been much more attention to racial justice than we've seen in this country in quite some time. But there's also largely a disconnect between this issue of racial justice and economic justice. So there are sometimes real and other times symbolic victories that are made. But at the bottom, two things seem to happen. One is that workers of color frequently feel like, well, I'm not necessarily getting anything out of this victory. And then with whites, it's played up to play on their resentment. So what do we do about this issue of racial justice and economic justice? And what does that mean? Kate, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer to that. I think, I think obviously in the UCW model and in our discussions about what social justice unionism can bring, I think it's critical and essential to me that we are organizing wall-to-wall unions of all workers. I think the chat, there's a little discussion about staff, inequities with staff. Kristen mentioned, you know, pay disparities for majority workers of color who are so often segregated into certain job classifications, service, some maintenance, clerical, or outsourced completely into, you know, work in Aramark or Sodexo or other terrible private jobs on campus. And so I think coming back to the importance of the wall-to-wall model, which I was reading up a little bit on the history of higher education organizing in the early days, and in the 1940s, there were the earliest unions were in higher ed. One was at Howard, was a CIO wall-to-wall model that really focused on the many ways in which workers, even in the university system, their daily lives at work are interconnected. And I do think, even though we still have so much to do and the obstacles are massive, the pandemic has revealed in some ways, in strange ways, the interconnectedness of workers on campus, whether that's just because of the fact that people cleaning the classrooms and fixing the buildings and supporting students in academic support roles are also in kind of daily connected to one another and to all the students. I think it does show the sort of the flow of work, and in a crisis, how important it is for workers to be organizing together in this kind of model. And then I think, as Crystal touched on, we have been discussing your book and this vision for social justice unionism and common good demands, and what that will look like when higher education workers seek to build alliances with coalition, with community groups around the importance of the public sector jobs of higher education, but also around demands for all kinds of public goods and services to be reinvested in. And I think the struggle will be a long one, but I think the only hope is in sort of not only building wall to wall in the university and building worker power across the many lines that are used to divide workers, but also across these lines where, community groups and tenants might see the university as a gentrifying force and those in it as in opposition to them. And we, through our long-term work, need to start to begin to kind of break down those divides. But yeah, no easy answers. And I think Kristen will have a lot to add in terms of being on the ground there at VCU.
Thank you. Kristen.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely going to agree that there's no easy answers. I mean, I think that we, in Richmond, we're organizing in a city that once identified as the capital of the Confederacy. I don't think that there is a kind of clearer set of battle lines that can be drawn than to be trying to build a university committed to racial justice in a space with that kind of history. But I think both you, Bill, and you, Kate, have talked a little bit about how the work of racial justice in this country, for people who have really done that work very successfully and gotten real wins on behalf of working people of color, has been a project that unifies big coalitions and unifies like multiracial organizing spaces where people are able to work together to advance those goals. And I think that it's actually just really important to say that racial justice uplifts everybody. Ending police violence uplifts all of us. There's just no question that that's true. And I think anytime we're being presented with particularly like corporate models of racial justice that can have like really divisive methods or outcomes, we need to kind of stop and ask ourselves what's happening and talk about how we can build a vision for racial justice that isn't designed to unify only really small enclaves of people, which itself will then fail, right? And so for us at VCU, when I know faculty members who've talked about unionizing for a long time. And one of our conversations before we first started meeting with UCW organizers was that it would have to be a wall-to-wall model. There can't be justice at VCU that doesn't include hourly workers, contract workers, staff, graduate students, undergraduate workers. It's just not possible to do justice piecemeal. Like that's not a thing. And so we don't want to even talk about it with that language because it will fail and we will all take really terrible political lessons from that failure. And so, I think that in the early stages of organizing a union, you want to be intervening in the material realities of people's lives. We want to tackle wages. We want to tackle contracts. We want to tackle fair leave. Wage theft is a huge issue at VCU. But I think a union is going to create space for people to envision a city that really is a really special place for everybody to live and grow together. And I know in some of the committee meetings in my own department with union members, people are already talking about things like, well, we're a public university in the middle of the nation's capital. We were designed, we're not a founding father university. We were designed to meet the needs of working Richmonders. What if we had like guaranteed admission for RPS students to VCU? Like, what if we could just say the kids in our public schools right now have a right to go to this university and should be able to access this university without debt, without a hefty application process that feels really punitive? Like, what if they could just come here? And the reality is faculty want stuff like that. They want to be engaged in the local school system. They want to be engaged with their neighbors. They want to see the young people in our city really thriving. And we're not being offered policy pathways to make that happen. And it's not going to happen if we always turn to our admin and we say, well, what's racial justice on campus? Because they're always going to fund an initiative that makes the university look really good and only targets like 5 to 10 people. We want racial justice to scale. We want it for everybody in the city. And so that's going to have to mean building unity across some very historically rigid boundaries. And those boundaries are along lines of race, but they're also along lines of class and worker classification. And really only a wall-to-wall union is going to give us the infrastructure to make those interventions.
So we have just a few minutes for this section, and then we're going to open up for broader questions. And one of the questions that I have obsessed on for years is the question of the relationship of the union to demonstrating its commitment to improving and preserving the public sector. That there is a mixed history in the public sector unions, where you've had those that have been focused on preserving the situation for their members, but have abdicated a discussion about the broader public sector. And here we are in 2021. What do the two of you think about this question of the relationship of union building and fighting to preserve the public sector? And we have 5 minutes, which the two of you can split between yourselves. Kate, you want to start?
Yes, coming with the hard questions, Bill. Yeah, I think this is tough. I see UCW unions committed to this, so I guess I'll just hold up the work that you all are doing and we're doing in terms of looking to build broader political power, take fights against any public sector worker to state legislatures, to the streets, wherever. But I think it is an ongoing challenge in the labor movement. And I don't have an answer for the broader movement. I will defer that to union members, I guess, at this point. Here to continue to support that struggle and the challenge.
Fair. Kristen?
Well, I think we could talk about this for a lot more than 5 minutes, and so I'll try to be chill. But I think that public sector unionism, there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and there's also it's really hamstrung by a lot of policy. That's really true in Virginia, which is a right to work state. We don't have collective bargaining rights. And there's been a kind of like targeted effort to disable public sector workers in states like Virginia, in part because those workers not only disproportionately serve communities of color, but they advocate alongside those communities when they're doing their job well. And so I think that part of what is going to have to happen is we're going to have to start talking more in Richmond about the fact that a majority of our public sector workforce in Richmond is African American. And I think often at the university, we, for reasons of class, we really focus on faculty as workers, and our faculty is disproportionately white. I think if you see our faculty is like between 80 and 90% white, which is its own issue that is going to need serious intervention that I hope the union is going to be able to move forward. But when we talk about public sector spaces in a way that erases all of the workers of color who advance that work on behalf of the public, we do a tremendous disservice to those workers and the constituents that they serve by erasing work that is really essential. And we also empower the private sector to treat itself as the only solution to job availability. And so in Richmond, for instance, every time a casino or a coliseum or some incredibly damaging for-profit venture comes along, we're all told as a city that we have to accept that development, we have to accept that business, we have to accept those risks because there's no other way to get jobs. There is absolutely ways to get jobs. We can expand our pre-K through 12 workforce. We can expand the workforce in our DMV so people don't have to wait in line all the time. We can expand the workforce at the social services department so people who are using social services don't have to wait in line all the time. We can expand the workforce at our polling locations. We can expand our polling locations. You know, like there's actually lots of capacity in Richmond to be employing Richmonders through the public sector, including at VCU. But part of what we have done is we have really, by not talking about that workforce and not talking about who works there and who they serve, we have really empowered the private sector to completely dominate the narrative on economic development in our cities and employment in our cities in a way that advantages no one except people who are earning profit off of labor of others. And that is incredibly damaging to everyone, but it is particularly damaging to communities of color.
So thank you. Thank you both for this discussion. We're going to be opening it up. And before we do, I just want to follow up on that question and pose a challenge to you, the listeners and participants and union members. I would argue that we must make public sector unions a vehicle to reform the public sector. When the public, our constituents actually see that we're there engaged in a fight for better public service, more efficient public service, we win their support. When we look like we are protecting ourselves and ourselves alone, we're condemning ourselves to annihilation. I mean, it really is that stark. Once upon a time, maybe some of these unions didn't have to worry about that. Increasingly, we really do, that we public sector unions and public sector unionists are actually holding up a torch, leading a fight to reform, to improve public services, and to preserve a public sector. Because without a public sector, excuse me, excuse me, let me just stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bill, Kate, and Kristen for that wonderful conversation. I'm going to start taking or reading out the questions that we've got. We only have a few so far, so you have time for leisurely answers. And then if a flood comes in later on, I will manage it so that we have enough time to get to at least the kind of big theory, big theoretical gist of it. So the first question actually touches on something, Kristen, you alluded to, about the kind of state of public sector collective bargaining in Virginia, which is in a state like Virginia, which has a history of, has a present of laws that are designed to weaken organized labor. What are the kind of individual considerations people need to be making when they join our workers' organization? And then kind of more broadly, what are the kind of strategies we need to be putting on the table to fight both the legal conditions that have been imposed upon us, but also to kind of fight around them and get wins in spite of them?
Hey, I see you making no motions. You want me to tackle it? Well, I think so. One of the things that you said early in that question, Crystal, is like, what are the legal considerations that we need to be thinking about? And or sorry, not legal. What are the individual considerations that people may make when they join a union? And I really want to say there are no individual considerations when you join a union, right? Like unions and unionization is the recognition that we only have power collectively. And if you are somebody who can negotiate on your own behalf and have power individually, there's no choice that you can make that's going to benefit everybody, right? Like we only, we rise together, right? Like we only have power through collective action. And so my advice to you, if you're thinking about joining a union, is join a union. Like you should join a union because that is better for you and that is better for everyone around you. If we're thinking about, or we're raising this question about how to have collective power and be winning back rights that have been stripped of us from things like state code, which is the case with the right to strike and collective bargaining, I would say that you need not just worker power, but you need statewide strategy. And part of what I really love about UCW's model is we are a statewide local with campus-based chapters. And so in my own department, if we want to do some organizing around contracts or leave policy evaluations, whatever it is we want to work on, we can work on that locally. But if what we want to do is go to the General Assembly and tell them that we are going to have collective bargaining rights and they're going to give it to us, we're actually going to need a statewide force that can leverage pressure on elected officials in different districts, because we're going to need lots of people to really support those bills. And I think part of what we have seen in Virginia through the collective bargaining bill that was passed in 2020 that goes into effect this year in 2021 is it does not matter if you have Democrats in the House, in the Senate, and in the governor's seat. If those Democrats can protect their campaign donations by not supporting workers, that's what they will do. And if it looks like they can eke out the weakest possible collective bargaining bill that gives no one collective bargaining, but makes every single unit or every single district across the state fight individually for collective bargaining for their own selves, that's not good enough, right? And that's not what we expect from the Democratic Party, which asserts that it represents workers. So part of what my hope is that we can start drawing some hard lines between the Democrats who represent us, some of whom have governed predominantly in Republican-controlled eras and have had very few demands placed on them to actually serve working people and pass as kind of blue. And so I think a statewide higher education union is going to create opportunity for us to look at our own elected officials and say, are you actually representing us? Or are you hoping that you will pass as progressive because you have the label Democrat on you somewhere? If the latter, we're going to replace you and we're building the infrastructure to replace you. So I'm excited about being able to organize kind of like within my own shop and also on the state level through a single political instrument.
And I think that covers a lot of it in terms of the political fight at the larger, legal and policy landscape. But I would say just even before that, you all are taking the first step. In Memphis, in the same context in the South, they didn't have collective bargaining rights. They, still don't for the state, but many pockets of the US South, workers have organized and demanded the right to bargain or the right to meet and confer, and then they've won it, or they've won concessions without it. So it's, the first step is building a union, building a movement, making the demand, building the power. And I would add from the industry perspective, we do see ourselves in a really tough spot and a critical place to organize in the South. And it's very important, but I think there's some freedoms in building anew that I think Solidarity Divided really shows us some of the entrenchment of the traditional labor movement, and higher education is not separate from that as an industry. And so there are plenty of pockets of higher education where even with a union, a long-standing right to bargain, many of the same problems still exist. So I think I think taking the first step to organizing, and also seeing, yes, there are so many challenges and so much work to do, but in the fissures, there are also some really cool opportunities to build in a different and broader way. And I think, you know, to Bill's point before about the importance of the public services themselves and holding them up and seeing, you know, our working conditions, your working conditions as student learning conditions, or, you know, transportation working conditions as critical to the rider's experience in the city, getting to work, all of these services as important and essential to change them, and aligning ourselves with students, with community members, with transportation riders, public school students. I think that's part of the nut as well. And we've been teasing that out tonight. So those are just a few things I'd add.
All right, I'm going to move on because the next question does segue from that very well. Someone asked about like kind of the title of this discussion, which is "As Goes the South, So Goes Education." And so I was wondering if the panelists could speak a little bit more about the particularities of the South, but also maybe talk a little bit about like the role of the South in kind of guiding national policy. So anything about kind of the particular history of the South with regards to labor and organized labor and race, and then, you know, maybe go from there.
Well, one of the things that that happened historically is that with the defeat of Reconstruction and the institutionalization of disenfranchisement of African American voters and many poor whites, you ended up having essentially an authoritarian regime, a one-party state in most of the South. And this, combined with what was called the white primary, allowed for many Southern elected officials at the federal level to develop an immense amount of seniority in the congressional system and come to dominate at the federal level, and serve to block or mutate change. They played a very negative role, for example, during the New Deal, in making sure that various provisions of the New Deal were segregated. And the problem is that as long as there's not been a sufficiently strong countervailing force in the South and the Southwest, I would argue, this has dragged us down. And so that's one of the reasons that unionization in the South becomes so critical.
Kate and Kristen, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I completely agree. I think that if you look at maps of the Black Belt in the United States, and you look at maps at Republican strongholds, and you look at data on voting patterns among people of color, you can really only draw one conclusion, which is that deliberate, pervasive infrastructure has been built across the US South as a way of undermining Black political power in the United States. And I think that is, I mean, I just think that is clear. And there's a wonderful article by Bob Wing, I think, called "The Importance of the Fight for the South," that really makes the case that if we care about, really surviving as a nation and as a species, we are going to have to actually invest in fighting for the enfranchisement and empowerment of people across the region. It's just a non-negotiable. And so I think that union organization is an essential component of that. I think it's going to take a lot of different types of organizing across the South, but I don't think it can be done. I don't think it can be done without unions. And I think that when we in the public sector fight, for instance, to end right to work in Virginia, it is not just universities that will benefit. It's not just public education that will benefit. It's UPS facilities, it's Amazon facilities, it's poultry plants. Like the opportunities to unionize workers are going to explode. And if we are able to really build back a progressive and very strong labor movement, we're going to be able to get interventions at the federal level that are going to make a really big difference in the lives of working people. And so I don't think this is a spectator sport. I don't think we can sit it out. I think that it is going to take a lot of work, but I think it's work that is worth doing. And I think it's work that really literally saves lives. And so I'm excited to be supporting that work at VCU.
I will just add, because the question asked about the quote, and I W.E.B. Du Bois, and I think speaking to this very need, as the South goes, so goes the nation, I believe was the quote, to talk about how the South represents just this key place for working class in terms of, you know, both resistance and exploitation. And I think over the last 15 years, as migration patterns have changed and more people are moving to the South, more African Americans who migrated to the North, where Kristen and I both touched on the trends of work there, moving back to the South. And Atlanta and Texas, I believe, cities in Texas are the fastest growing in the country. So more true now than even when Du Bois said it. And the resistance and efforts like you all are doing are just so critical.
All right, we've got 3 questions left and not a lot of time to get through them, so I'm going to ask for slightly shorter answers if possible, but they're meaty, so it's going to be hard. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. So the next question is one that I'm actually really excited about, and it's, what do our panelists think of the PRO Act? And I'll expand it a little bit and just say, what can and should unions be doing to balance local, state level organizing and intervening nationally, Kristen, as you were alluding to earlier?
Well, I just want to say pass the PRO Act. And I also want to say that my elected representative, Mark Warner, is currently not willing to sign on to the PRO Act. And so it is a real sign to me as a Virginian when my elected representatives break from the party and break from kind of national trends and everything that we know about polling around workers' rights, that Mark Warner wants to say to us, I'm not willing to represent a majority of people or even my constituents. I'm going to represent corporate interests. So if y'all want to send Mark Warner a message, the minute I mute myself, I'm going to be linking you to his page, because Mark Warner needs to hear from every single resident of Virginia that his behavior is unacceptable and he needs to co-sign onto the PRO Act.
But in addition, one of the things that we need to learn from the failure of the Employee Free Choice Act is that we've got to connect the right to organize with fighting for economic justice. Now, for many of us who are union members, it's an obvious connection, but for the broader public, it is not necessarily an obvious connection. And sometimes people can be hoodwinked into believing that the fight to make it easier for workers to join or form unions is an institutional interest of organized labor, as opposed to fighting for a right on the part of workers. So we need to be always thinking about how we demonstrate to regular people, particularly to non-union workers, why there is this direct connection between building power for them, giving them the right to join or form a union, and the consistent fight for economic justice. I mean, it's a mass struggle. It's not a lobbying campaign.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kristen and Bill. All right, next question. This is from Gary. Gary, our fantastic organizer with UCWVA, asks, it seems clear to me that we're going to need to win progressive taxation to make the gains that we need. But corporate Dems accept as a premise that taxes are bad and align themselves with the right wing, while the left doesn't really think taxes are sexy or anti-government for various reasons. So in this context, how can we, the labor movement, help win progressive taxation to fund all the big stuff that we need?
Who's going to take that? Kate, are you going to take it?
I defer to you. I can speak to it. I'll start.
Go ahead.
Let's find out together in Virginia, everyone. No, but I do think, I think we've seen some powerful examples now. And actually this speaks back to sort of more of coalition work and movement work with unions and across the public sector around chronic defunding and who's taking the money. And I think in Connecticut, for instance, some of the bargaining for the common good network work has been holding up examples during the pandemic of common good work where they're demanding that corporations pay their fair share. I know that's more of a corporate tax rate, and we're thinking more income-based progressive taxation. But I would say that it is going to take a lot of building work in coalition and changing the narrative around who is and isn't paying and what we're losing when we don't have, full funding for our public services. And I think that's part of the challenges we've talked about now. And workers have a lot to say to that in terms of both the services and the need of the public sector work and what is at stake when these funds are just slashed and given away to corporations, to the wealthy, and so on. So seems like the opportunity to kind of align and work together around changing some of the power dynamic and taking on some of the real enemies even if it's also in a sort of legislative fight. And I think the Connecticut example is a pretty powerful one. A number of UCW members have looked to. So I hope Bill and Kristen can also speak to more specifics on this, Gary, but I'm excited for us to work on it together.
Kristen, you want to say something?
Well, I think I'll just add that I think that the right has very successfully crafted a narrative where most people identify themselves as a protagonist, as a taxpayer. And I feel very sympathetic to people who are paying regressive taxes through things like food taxes. And, like there's like energy tax, like we're paying a lot of regressive taxes in Virginia. We're getting very little in terms of public services. And then we're paying again for things like tuition, right? And so I think that we have an opportunity with a pandemic that has exploded the wealth of a very small number of billionaires and devastated a huge percentage of the rest of the population to start to raise awareness about how wealth inequality is structured and how taxation can be structured such that we as a majority as the 99% benefit, and it's really the 1% that needs to actually finally come in and pay into a system that they use very heavily, but that they don't support.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I would say that part of what I think we have to do is quite literally diagram this, because most people at a certain point, this just becomes, unintelligible. What folks have to understand, one of the things that's become clear is that when taxes are targeted, we're more likely to win. In other words, if you can say we're increasing taxes in order to fund schools, because there's this distrust of government that has been inflamed by the right over the years, so that people are really reluctant. So targeting is one of the things that's critical. But the other thing is that we really need to diagram. It'd be good to have a good short video that basically shows what the tax rate has been from the 1950s to present on different parts of the population. Because what you're talking about, what you're both talking about, is that there's been a declining tax rate for the wealthy and for the corporations. There's been an increase in various forms of regressive taxation. People in the middle are feeling absolutely squeezed, and services decline. And so it becomes this absolute maelstrom that's taking us all down. And we need to explain this in a way that regular people can get it and understand what is going on and who is behind this.
All right, I'm getting the red light that I need to start wrapping things up, but I just want to real quick ask for a very quick 1-minute answer to this last question because I think it's a good one. And Bill, if you don't mind, what does social justice unionism mean in an international context? And how can labor organizations, public or private, support and stand in solidarity with workers across the world?
1 minute as opposed to 1 hour, huh? What it means is fighting for immigrant rights on the basis of understanding why people are coming to the United States, that they are largely from the global South coming, not because everyone wants to be in America, but because their homelands are being destroyed through the direct policies of the United States government and corporations. And as a result, we need to not only help those countries, but people that want to come here need to come here in order to survive. We need to be joining with them. We need to have solidarity across borders with and helping folks organize as well as bargain collectively. When we were building the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 1930s, most people don't realize that Mexican trade unionists helped to build CIO unions in the South. That's right, Mexican. It's not just this one-sided thing, that we got help from other folks. So that's, to me, very briefly what it means.
Incredible. Okay, thank you so much, all of our panelists, for taking the time to answer all these amazing questions. Thank you, everyone who asked these questions. If we could just have one last virtual round of applause, either with your little reactions or in the chat. And I just want to say one last congratulations to our comrades at VCU for an incredible Going Public week, which is still not over. There is, for those of you in Richmond and who can drive to Richmond, going to be a beautiful event on Saturday, on May Day. Can someone drop the details for that in the chat if they want folks to join? And other than that, happy May Day, solidarity to everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Abner Clay Park, noon to 3 in Richmond. All right. Good evening, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.